Hi everyone. How did white women sexually abuse black slaves? Historical fact or speculation? Let's talk a little bit about what some present as historical fact, which may or may not fall into the category of speculation, which is the product of the writer's imagination when we talk about the sexual abuse to which black slaves were subjected during the slave system. Male black slave, which were treated as objects of pleasure by white women to satisfy the lowest instincts that a woman can have, fulfilling those sexual fantasies that some women had. Was this sexual behavior of some white women during slavery on the southern plantations against male slaves pure speculation or historical facts supported by real fact? These are some of the questions that we will try to answer in this video. If masculine black female slave owners exploited the black woman's body for her sexual gratification, what prevented a female slave owner from doing the same to a male slave? This is where to tell as a real historical fact, a drama, which is the product of the imagination of a writer who uses this type of fictional drama to attract the attention of the reader, and in the case of a movie or video on YouTube, to produce the same effect on the audience which consumes this type of story. According to the historian, few scholars have viewed the relationships of enslaved men and free white women through the lenses of sexual abuse, in part because of gendered assumptions about sexual power. This is in keeping with both the standard feminist conceptualization of rape as a tool of patriarchal oppression, as well as the traditional notion of women as too weak emotionally and physically to commit serious crime, let alone sexual abuse, the idea that men cannot be raped. Historians themselves have shied away from these truths. The sexuality of black men and accurate representations of the intimate violations that were integral to the plantation system still matter. Prominent in all of these studies is the ubiquity of sexual violence in the lives of enslaved women. But the next logical line of inquiry, to compare what women suffered from the sexual violation of enslaved men, never arrived. And in some ways, this topic feels as far off the intellectual grid today as it ever was. Enslaved people also understood that the slave market was expansive, a mobile, spatially unbound economic network that might be situated in urban slave pens just as easily be found in porches, kitchens, dining rooms, and bedrooms, fields, and the quarters, along with the pathways and roads surrounding them. The market and white slave-owning women's presence in it was continuous across public and domestic space. They bought, sold, and managed slaves all along that network. In all of these spaces, slave-owning women supported the slave trade economy. They speculated in slaves. They hired out enslaved women as wet nurses, often separating those mothers from their own infants. And in urban centers like New Orleans, brothel-keeping, slave-owning women initiated and orchestrated acts of sexual violence against enslaved women and men. They Were Her Property is focused on typical female slave owner, a white married woman who enslaved 10 or fewer people. This is, as Jones Rogers argues, a vast category when compared to the elite Southern women who left behind diaries and letters and have never been studied systematically. Jones Rogers mines legal records and enslaved people's testimonies to show that these typical slave-owning women were deeply concerned with all manner of financial and disciplinary matters related to their human property. What of sexual relations between planter class white women and slave men socially accepted behavior? Under what circumstances did this type of behavior occur? How should they be described in terms of power, agency, and consent? Answering these questions involves analyzing historical records through the lens of power, relationships, parsing through the complexities of race, class, and gender hierarchies. In a society where people considered high class always looked for reasons to show the people in the lower social part who had control and relationship between slave owners and slaves was based on that dynamic of imposition of power both by the slave owners as well as slave-owning women of high society. Why these women chose to sexually abuse slaves probably varied by situation. Perhaps some of them were simply bored or sexually frustrated with the little attention her husbands paid her in society where white men who owned black slaves sexually exploited black women to fulfill their sexual needs. It is possible the sexual exploitation of slaves by women who had little power in relation to white men, was a source of enjoyment that created a feeling of power. The fact that affairs between planter class women and slaves were relatively uncommon is unsurprising. White women in the South were sexually restricted as compared to their male counterparts, and 19th century contraceptive techniques were not nearly effective or accessible enough to ward off possibility of pregnancy. Still, sexual contact between white women and black men did occur in slaveholding societies, more often than perhaps many are aware. By focusing attention on the ways that multiple and sometimes conflicting sources of oppression and power are intertwined, such as intersectional analysis, allows us to make sense of how persons occupying a position of low status in one social area can simultaneously occupy one of high status in another. Our knowledge about sexuality in American slavery has always been based on fragmented evidence and presumptions about the possibilities for cruelty and control. Something that we have to understand is slave society, where slaves were considered less than human. Socially, they occupied the lowest positions, which you want to accept or not, allows us to observe the process by which social hierarchies are sustained, where black slaves were at the bottom of that social hierarchy and slave owners at the top. In the case of white women and black men, we can use this type of analysis to better understand the ways in which elite Southern white women used oppressive gender notions of female purity and sexual subservience to maintain racial hierarchy. White women were responsible for upholding traditional Christian values and keeping peace within the domestic sphere. As such, they were valued for their homemaking abilities, maternal instinct, and perhaps above all else, their virtue. As one letter to a South Carolinian periodical geared toward young women put it, the honor and virtue Southerners attributed to white women, especially of the upper class, was nearly synonymous with the reputation for sexual purity, sustained by restraint, prudence, and modesty in every area of life, which in many cases the teaching and demands of the church were a factor to be considered as a symbol of morality and purity. Some writers of books on the subject considered that this form of violent coercion also inevitably became a source of sexual scandal, and not just for the white men who prowled the slave quarters. White women were also accused of dominating, satisfying themselves with, and in effect raping black men. Accusations of white female impropriety could ruin a woman's reputation within her family. At the very least, more seriously, gossip and innuendo were used to undermine a woman's legal standing or sully her carefully guarded reputation beyond the family estate. But in the most extreme cases, this type of behavior was often hidden from the public as a way to maintain the honor of upper-class women whose bad reputation was known to their closest family and friends. Type of white women who used male slaves much more than a work tool to use them as a tool of pleasure, often against the dignity of the slaves themselves. Any type of high society white woman who would present this type of anti-moral behavior according to social or Christian norms. White women whose affairs with slaves were made known faced varying degrees of public humiliation, the rejection of the family, but also the loss of reputation among friends from the same social circle, who condemned this type of behavior considered abominable and repugnant. When a planter's daughter or wife was discovered to be pregnant by a black slave, great pains were taken to cover up the pregnancy as a way to save the honor of the family, but also to not damage the reputation of a white woman before single men from the same social circle. At the time, she can be considered wife material with morally respectable reputation. The resulting child of this relationship, considered immoral and disgusting, might have been sold into slavery. But infanticide was not an uncommon means of avoiding social scandal. How sexually promiscuous were white women during this time on the southern plantation? Whether a high-class woman or a poor woman, in a conservative society where women of the class competed with each other, when there is a rumor associated with the sexual activity of women who were part of the wealthy upper class and with social influence, don't have the slightest doubt, white women's sexuality was heavily regulated by law as well as by culture. Adultery was considered a greater offense for women than for men and was punished more harshly. Similarly, giving birth out of wedlock was considered much more of a social problem for white women than for anyone else. Something that historically everyone knows is that in private, Many plantation women were unhappy with their lack of freedom and the expectation that they remain dutiful, obedient, pleasant, and cheerful while their husbands had affairs with or raped female slaves. But this negative reaction of a wife about her husband's extramarital affairs is a type of secret that everyone knew, but very few of them dared to complain to their husband about marital behavior considered disloyal, and even more so when some of them knew that the mixed-race slave children who surrounded them were their husband's offspring was considered humiliating and heartbreaking. Was this extramarital behavior with a black slave woman one of the reasons why some upper-class women had sex with black slaves, either out of revenge or the need for sexual satisfaction? From my point of view, no, and I will explain my reason. This is not to excuse the actions of sexually abusive white women, nor is it to suggest that female sexual abuse of slave black men would not have occurred had some women enjoyed a higher status in society. However, just as slave-owning white women often took out their frustrations on slaves, black men through excessive cruelty, humiliation, and violence, they probably used sex as a means of control in a society in which black slaves were relatively powerless in comparison to the high societal status of white high society women of the time. What is the origin of this behavior considered dehumanizing towards black slaves physically, but also emotionally? When you analyze the history of slavery in the United States, but also in the Caribbean island, in the first centuries of colonization, the majority of slaves were bought on the slave market through the transatlantic slave trade. But in the 17th century, this market was restricted. Reasons why slaveholder in need of slaves to work in the harsh conditions on plantations used much darker resources. This is where the use of the black woman's womb as a slave farm was one of the solutions, but also the use of black slaves with good physical attributes of some male slaves chosen to impregnate black women to increase the slave population as breeding slaves, something that may or may not produce some type of questions in the minds of the people who are listening to this type of narrative, where white women abuse black slaves sexually to satisfy their intimate needs, but also white women emotionally used black men by imposing the desires of a woman on a man in a male-dominated society. Dominating a black man was something that filled a white woman from high society with satisfaction. Don't have the slightest doubt, something that we must recognize, both the black slaves and the black women were sexually exploited and their body seen as a work tool. They were also emotionally humiliated, but also dehumanized as human beings by both the slave owners and whether a white man owned slaves or a white woman of high society who used black slaves as a sexual object. If for some reason you want to know how real the physical and emotional abuse at the hands of white women towards black slaves was during slavery, in the description of this video, I will leave you several resources, books, articles, research work, who will explain on this type of topic. Ladies and gentlemen, if you like this type of topic, please subscribe to this channel, leave your comments as a way to help this channel.